Every great creative work stands on the shoulders of giants. Welcome to RetroInspection, where we examine and find out where the things we love today came from.
Yeah, and you'll listen. Don't shy away from anyone's writing, because people live in their own times and their own ages, and you can, as a critical human being, you can separate the work from the time and the attitudes of the person who wrote it, and you can always gain something from it. You don't necessarily have to like it, but Shakespeare was not the most accepting author.
No,
but we still read him and admire him or them, however many people who actually were Shakespeare.
People got the right to their own feelings, though, and if you're one of the if you're part of one of the ethnicities being commented upon, you've got a right to not be happy about this, and I think probably a right to not want to continue with the work.
You of course, if you don't like it, don't read it. But there's some artistry that you might find valuable, especially if you're your own creative artist, and you can find inspiration from a lot of things.
Yeah.
And other artists who have been there, and look, he had obviously lived a very troubled life, in a very troubled time, like we all do, and he's a product of those times. But his voice is still important, and it's still inspirational today. And it's hard to say about what his attitudes really were about.
Yeah, and I mean, we probably want to tread. Yeah, right, because it feels like we should tread carefully on this, because you could say, "Oh, yeah, well, here's what he wrote," but then you're like, "Yeesh, here's what Lovecraft wrote."
Right,
but it may not be for us to be drawn those lines, man. I don't think anybody's real interested in seeing a couple of middle-aged white guys opine on levels and severity of racism.
No, I don't think so either. But I think that you do yourself a disservice if you dismiss things out of hand and not analyze it and critique it in an honest way.
Yeah.
And you can't just say, this is racist and I therefore won't read it. You have to analyze, you have to study it and say, maybe there was another motivation there. You don't know. You can't read people's minds, especially over these distances of years. So, there's always an opportunity to learn, even from the worst people. And if that's the case here, why not?
Yeah.
But
I don't know if I'm 100% there with you, but I see what you're getting. I see what you're getting at. I understand what you're saying.
I mean, I'm not. Frankly, there are some things in his work that I did not find offensive. I found curious. Some of his description of different peoples were interesting and different, and didn't necessarily shock me, but were different enough from what I expect or what I would write that I took note of.
Oh, yeah, and that certainly, I think, can be explained by differences in the era.
Right, and I can't ascribe anyone motives because of that. So
yeah, I mean, this is definitely a guy writing in the 30s stylistically. Apart from anything else that we've been talking about here, there's a style thing that is of that era. And you would also get that from other pulp writers of that era. Lovecraft was writing as if he were a guy that were writing in some cases 30 to 40 years earlier.
Right. He was writing in the 19th century.
Very much so, yeah. And we'll get to Lovecraft, I'm sure, for something at some point, but for damn sure, Washington Irving and Nathaniel Hawthorne cast a long shadow over Howard. And definite influences on his style.
But I did enjoy most of it. There were some times where I thought, "Oh, this is a little blue," especially for someone who had been so educated in the classics. But it wasn't offensive enough for me to say I'm not going to read this, or it wasn't,
right.
Cardboard kinds of characters that I found problematic in some of our earlier reviews.
Yeah.
I didn't find Conan to be cardboard at all. He has a simple motivation, even when he became king. But it wasn't. It'll get me talking about the Lensman again. I just don't want to.
Okay, yeah, no, let's not poke that necessarily. But as far as him working blue, which you will see in some of the Conan stories, they are in sexual terms racy for their era, and there was a subset of pulp magazines, and Howard wrote for a lot of them, especially towards the end of his life, that were known as the spicy pulps. Now, in terms of their sexual content, they're going to be pretty low key, compared to the modern era. But for 1935, there were a lot of heaving bosoms and tattered bodices and stuff like that, and that that was pretty, pretty
lace
stuff.
Robes.
Yeah,
a lot of lace robes or sheer dresses.
Right. Yeah. Like a lot of tawny muscles rippling under skin, kind of stuff like that. Shit. But even within the space of 15 years, you get even more comparatively explicit Mickey Spillane and Ian Fleming. You don't, and you got some of that stuff even in 30s and 40s pulp crime things too. Raymond Chandler never got that explicit with stuff, but every now and then there were parts in some Dashiell Hammett stories, some of the Continental Op stuff. You would run across these kind of hotcha girls, and your kind of your femme fatales in those stories, but you would also see it in comics. The early Catwoman, well, actually really probably was Catwoman across the entirety of her history is that kind of a figure. But the female villains in something like Flash Gordon, female villains in Terry and the Pirates, that kind of stuff. And they were, so then that's when you get into the whole good girl, bad girl art schism.
Like, subscribe, repost, share everywhere. To see what else we're up to, visit xynobooks.com, xenobooks.com.